Well, kia ora koutou. If things are going right, this is the fourth of my presentations about the gold rush. This time I want to look at something a bit different, and that's the idea that I've had. I've shown a lot of people around Bendigo in central Otago, and this sort of cottage is pretty typical of what you see up there. And everyone always remarks on the same thing. How could people live in such a tiny space? And so I want to deal with a couple of the myths around this today and look at what people really lived in, because I think you'll be surprised to find that what the miners lived in was actually not too dissimilar to what you live in now. Okay, except for double glazing, I suppose. But the first miners to the goldfields of California, New South Wales, Victoria, Nelson, Otago and the Yukon all shared one characteristic. They carried calico or tents for shelter. Quite quickly into each rush narrative, the idea of the miner and his tent became symbolic of the rush for gold. Living in tents also came to represent the ephemeral nature of the gold or rush towns, which helped shape popular thinking of miners essentially as footloose transients, ready to hastily abandon one particular goldfield for the perceived riches at a new field. And it led Bill Garner, who has turned his thesis into a very good book actually, to comment, the gold rushes introduced a long period of unsettlement in which a large proportion of the population was camped out. And it was this social condition that underwrote the political character of the goldfields. Now in central Otago, these are typical Victorian pictures. This one here is Californian. And again, you can see here the structure that's a pretty, I wouldn't call that a tent. That's basically a frame that's got calico stretched over it in the shape of a tent. And then here, these are, in this painting by Edwin Stockwell, it shows the tents as a lot more substantial. And we'll meet very similar structures to those when we look at a picture from central Otago. But in central Otago, the first tents were either recycled army issue or were made for the purpose in new factories in Melbourne or in San Francisco and brought to Otago by veteran diggers. So you can see there the distinctive shape of pup tents. You know what I mean by pup tents, like the cheap things you get at the warehouse. And if you look here though, some of them are larger, and this image you can actually look up if you go on to, if you do a search wherever you're looking at this video in the world, if you do a search on ENZB, just those letters, you'll get to a site that's Early New Zealand Books, and then you can look up there Vincent Pike History of the Gold Discoveries in Otago, and that image is in there, and you can actually look at it quite well there. ENZB, I'll warn you though, you go there, you basically lose an afternoon looking at things. Now later structures tended to be like this, and I apologise for the fact that it's not the sharpest photo, but this is from Manuheta Kia, now known as Alexandra. And if you look here, what we've got what looks like houses. These are not, these are tents. So what they have is a timber structure or a timber framework, and over that is stretched two sorts of canvas. One is ordinary calico. Now, you think, oh, is that waterproof? Oh yes, calico has one of the useful properties that when water hits it, it swells up and the water runs off. The one thing you can't do is if you touch it from the underside, the water will come straight through. And of course, what do kids do? So every parent there has yelled at these kids at least half a dozen times. So that's quite, you can see there's two, the other sort of calico is here, it's a darker sort, has been either oiled, which adds to waterproofing, or sometimes they used grease. Now, in central Otago in summer, I'm not sure I recommend that. Or sometimes they use tar, which guaranteed full waterproofing. It's just the stink of tar constantly would have been horrible. Now you notice that most of them have got chimneys, and what these are is these would be have fires in them, and the fires had two purposes. One's cooking, one's warmth. And you look at that and you think, you poor beggars, how sad are you? Well, if you look, these have actually got windows in, and the windows didn't always have glass in, they mostly just had material across them. But they had framed floors that actually lifted the floor off the ground, so you didn't get rising damp. And then those floors had carpet on them. Some of them even on the inside had matchwood linings or wooden panels lining them. And if some of the really entrepreneurial ones would actually, or inventive ones at least, would shove tussock between the canvas and there to try and achieve some level of insulation. So you can see there's clotheslines, there's wood piles and everything. This is a small community. And what's interesting is this has been settled at this point when the photo's taken about a year. So it's not a case of people building this sort of structure and then moving on quickly. They've lived there for a year, including a winter in central Otago, and they're still there. 1863, and that's one of my collection from, I think it was given to me by an elderly resident of Alexandra. But anyway, they were lit by kerosene or whale oil lamps, and some of them can be actually quite large. And sometimes if your family expanded, you could end up with sort of a grouping of houses that made up, I suppose, almost a compound. Now, additions were made to them. Now look at this particular thing. This is the first Otago gold rush. Now the Otago gold rush, everyone will tell you, started in Gabriel's Gully. No, it didn't. It started on Linda's Pass about 6 months earlier. Gabriel's Gully comes out in April 1861. This one comes out in really late 1860, when an Australian who's making the road that's now the Linda's Pass found gold there. Well, what they did is they raised sod walls. This is Robert Booth lived in New Zealand for 5 years. He described what was going on. This is not his sketch. He described what he saw to a friend who was an artist who then sketched it. But they raised sod walls for two reasons. One is there's very little timber. There's some timber, but you have to make that last. And the second thing is sod is free. So they would raise these sod walls and then put tents above them. Now, this is a photo from Nelson, and it's much later. And you can actually see this. If you have a look at the tent, the tent doesn't go right down to the ground. You can see they've got a sod wall. And what's actually happened is the bottom of the tent has actually rotted slightly. So the sod wall comes right up to here, and then a solid sod chimney. When I say sod, I'm not talking brick, I'm talking digging squares of dirt out and stacking them while it's wet. Now that's not quite as Heath Robinson as you might think. It dries out on the inside, but if you keep the outside relatively damp, or rain does that anyway, it's totally windproof. So what this happens is that this gives you essentially quite a lot of protection against the wind. Now, fast forward, just down the road from here is Linda's Pass. Now this has the Linda's Pass Hotel. It's called the 9 Mile Reserve. It's there now. And this is, you can see the old Lewis Pass Road. It now goes over the other side, so it's right over there now. But this is the in the 1930s, they had a work scheme where they paid miners to go mining, and what you got was 10 shillings plus some contribution towards your food and lodgings per week. And if you made gold, I think it was more than about half an ounce, you had to contribute the extra gold to the unemployment board. Well, of course, no one declared more than half an ounce ever. And there's whole families living here. But again, what is interesting is they've raised sod walls. And they have, remember I showed you Manuhera Care, this one? So if you look at these, and look at these are about the same thing. So again, why would they do that? No timber. If you go there now, there are willow trees everywhere. And of course, they would have built something a bit more substantial. But these low sod walls. Now, the problem with that, what is left, if you're an archaeologist and you come along and go, there was a town here, what have you got? Well, you've got a flattened bit of land. That's it. You might be lucky enough to get post holes, but mostly, like at Bendigo, there's a whole pile of these, and you can sell a flattened, but the tussock still grows, but it sort of looks, it's too square to be normal, and all you can do is say, well, probably one of these was there. Then you get to the actual towns. Now, look at this. This is the earliest photo. It's February 1863. How early is that? Well, Central Otago Gold Rush breaks out on August 22, 1862. So the earliest people can get up here, you just think about the logistics of it. No one's going to be up here till, what, mid-September. And then you've got to build a whole town. So this town here is 4 months old. And so you see this and you're, oh, they've got a town. Well, no, they haven't. What they've got is a whole pile of storefronts that are made of wood, and what's behind them? Those. Okay? So look at it again, and you can actually faintly see the lines here that I've had people say, oh, that's corrugated iron. No, it's not. No one's getting corrugated iron up there. Not until probably mid-1863 at the earliest. There's no roads up there. No roads. None. So how do you get building supplies up there? You don't. How do you get wood? Well, that's a different story. Wood I've told you about in other videos. It's milled at Makarora, put into rafts, so the cut wood's formed into a raft. They cart it across the Makarora Flats to Lake Wanaka, float it across Wanaka, down the upper Clutha, until you get here to Clyde. And so that's an early picture of Clyde, and those are wooden fronts, because that's the law. You couldn't have a shop. They kind of applied a law, I would presume. Most of our laws, let me establish something about mining laws. We didn't come up with anything. We copied and pasted the Australians. Okay? 1857, our first mining law. In fact, our mining law now, in 2020, which is when I'm recording this, were essentially is built on the 1857 law, which was pinched from Victoria. It was upgraded in 1862, again in 1863, and it's had various tweaks along the way, but pretty well the same. The law said you had to have a wooden front, and then there's something really, really useful if you're wanting to interpret one of these photographs. Two things you've got to always bear in mind. One, photographs were really expensive, 1863. This would have cost quite a lot of money. You've got to question the purpose of that photograph. In this case, they're just wanting to get people who are down in Dunedin to come up and visit, to come up and see, look, we have civilization up here. Why you want people? You want people up finding gold, you want people drinking drinks, you want people eating food and staying in hotels. And Clyde as a town, it started off called Coal Point, then it was nicknamed, well, across the way was nicknamed Mutton Town, Coal Point becomes Dunstan. Dunstan becomes kind of Upper Dunstan. At some point it was called Hartley Town after Hartley, who found the gold there. Then it becomes Clyde when John Connell comes through in 1865 and names it that. But anyway, so hotels, there's one. How do we know? It's got a light in the front. And there's another hotel here. You can see that light. There's another hotel there. And of course that doesn't count all the sly grog places that you didn't advertise anything to say you were selling grog. But canvas stores were the norm. They weren't actually the unusual thing. So if you look at some of the early accounts, then we've got at Logantown, this was built in 1869, late 1868, the building materials are of wood and calico with a few sheets of galvanised iron judiciously distributed for shelter against the inclemency of the weather. At German Hill in 1865, which is a bit earlier, there was a windstorm came in and it flattened the entire commercial heart of the township, and even the most substantial building, which was the premises of the clothier Mr. Isaacs, every single clothing outfit in Otago at one point was owned by someone with the surname Isaacs. They were a Jewish family that they didn't get on that well. Often they would start as partners, but then you'd see an announcement saying Samuel Isaac and Richard Isaac are no longer partners, and then you'd find them advertising rival companies. But anyway, which was made of a wooden frame over which canvas was stretched with a corrugated iron roof, was also flattened. So what happened was that you would only switch from canvas to corrugated iron, which was quite expensive. Every bit of corrugated iron had to be landed. We weren't making it in Dunedin till around, I'm going to say 1866, possibly 67, around there. Maybe a little bit earlier, but otherwise the corrugated iron came from Melbourne or from America, landed in Melbourne. It didn't come direct from America to here. Normally shipping routes went from there to Australia, then to New Zealand, then was offloaded. Then you had to get it on a cart up to Central Otago, which was a number of days' travel, and iron was heavy. By the time it got up here, it was probably about as much as gold was worth by the kilo. If you look at this one, this is an advert for the greatest wonder of the world, W.M. Mears and Company. This was one of the stores that was here, and it actually lists will always be found the largest and best stock of goods in the colonies, both house and colonial made. A constant fresh supply by every steamer imported expressly for this result. This is the wonder of the world. And what it doesn't say there is basically that's a tent with a wooden front. So these are it sort of ruins your image to look at that and realise what you've got is wooden fronts and tents. But anyway, as soon as corrugated iron gets available, it's a game changer. We think of houses as permanent. They're not. A cottage like this, so two things are going on. One is it's entirely corrugated iron. It is in terms of its exterior. Windows, see the windows there? You know those are old and early. You see this one here, which is from memory, that's the Gare home in Cromwell. That's the great grandfather of Helen Clark, the New Zealand's former Prime Minister. But anyway, see the little panels. You know that's an old home because if you wanted glass transported up, it was packed in hay, and the smaller panes were more likely to arrive safely. So you get the little panes and you pack them in hay and pack them all in tight, and then you get the next box and you do the same thing. And so your windows were always multiple panes of glass. Never, ever large panes. That didn't happen until years later. But anyway, they would have these, and so a couple of things are useful with corrugated iron. One, when you don't have a lot of water, you can collect your drinking water from rainfall. Wasn't a huge amount of rainfall, but that water was always considered useful, even if it wasn't necessarily great for drinking. It was certainly good for washing and that sort of thing. And then the other thing on the end, the only permanent structure you had to build, apart from your foundations, which were just sometimes just rocks, was your chimney, which you could build out of sods, out of mud brick, or out of bricks themselves, or sometimes corrugated iron. Corrugated iron chimneys had a really nasty habit of drying out and catching fire, so they weren't popularly used. So this here is another one where, but the thing with corrugated iron is you could actually transport that whole front panel as a, well, I've got something crawling across the lens there. How daft. Anyway, you could, that just put me off entirely. You could end up taking this front panel, side panel, side panel, side panel, roofs, 2 roof sections, and any internal walls, put it flat, kind of flat pack on a dray or cart, and then go to the next place you want it. Now, I've been in one of these, and I was in this is at Cambrians, and at Cambrians they actually had a tin miner's house that was being used to store hay, which was great because I went in there, and you can actually see that this was not just tin. I mean, they're not stupid. They're not going to live in a tin house in central Otago and wonder why they're turning blue through winter. So what they would do, this is called match lining, where it's not made of matches. I don't know why it's called match lining, but anyway, it was painted slats of timber, often tongue and groove, and that would come right up, and there would be a gap in the top where you could insulate it again with tussock or lamb's wool. Lamb's wool was a very good insulator for the main reason it doesn't have tussock's problem and it's not so flammable. And you can also see that these weren't just plain. I mean, people actually decorated them. They put wallpaper on the walls, often newspaper adverts, newspaper illustration, that sort of thing, and they would cover them to look nice, I suppose, just the same as you or I would. And some even, in Logantown, just as an example of these, Logantown at Bendigo, when the gold ran out there, they just carted huts from Bendigo straight across to Carrick and re-erected them. And apparently you could do the 14 miles generally in 2 days, towing a load, and it took a day to dismantle one, 2 days to shift it, and a day to put it up, and then you're living in your new house. Now, the hotels were also corrugated iron. Now, the big advantage of this over stone takes a long time to build. It does. Because you've got to wait for each successive layer to harden off. Also, if you're wanting to span any sort of a decent size, then again you've either got to put middle sort of roof structures or rooms or something like that to hold up kind of columns, or you had to actually know what you're doing. I mean, if you build a stone wall, if you're a muppet like me and you build a stone wall, you can get to about probably waist height with guessing and good luck. But any higher than that, people are going to know you didn't know what you're doing and it'll fall down. Well, it's bad if it's a hotel. But with corrugated iron, all you need is the wooden structure and then bang the corrugated iron over the top. So this is the Criterion Hotel in Alexandra. You could put that up, I mean, I'm not talking days, but certainly within a low number of weeks, you could build a hotel. And these had the big advantage, they were totally weatherproof. Disadvantage, there was a guy, Bolitho, who came through, who was a novelist. I've got his name wrong. Trollope. Anthony Trollope came through, and he stayed in one of these iron hotels, and he could hear, I don't know where I got the LIFO from, it was a very famous name from Reefton, but anyway, Trollope came through, and he stayed in one of these, he's sleeping in his room, well, trying to sleep, and he can, about 2 rooms over, he can hear the landlady and landlord talking about this idiot Trollope who's there at this particular time of year and what a twat he is and all that sort of thing. And of course he can hear everything. There's no soundproofing at all between the sheets of corrugated iron. Now, this here is the Back Creek Bakery, which is also coated in corrugated iron. Now, interestingly with this one, this would have had a stone oven. So the important thing's the oven. You can't do anything other than stone for an oven. Well, you can do it in clay for a wee while, but so they've got a stone oven in the back, but everything else is corrugated iron. So again, these can be taken down and shipped across to a different location. If you look at the Reefers Arms Hotel, now I don't know if you've watched the Butcher Baker Candlestick Maker, I think it's in that one, where I talk about James Beer going from the general store to hotel and general store back to just the hotel. But anyway, he ends up, this is his hotel, the Carrick Range Hotel, and it's flat packed down and shifted over to the Carrick Range. Now, the description of it had it 35 feet long, which is quite a decent size for them. Dining room, parlour, kitchen, 10 comfortably furnished bedrooms, corrugated iron, and get this, American timber. None of your Australian stuff, American timber, including a stable and outhouses. And that's actually a picture of the hotel. That was at a place, it's called the Carrick Range Hotel, but it's actually built at a place called Courtsville there. And so that's not just a shack. That's quite a decent hotel. That's the Golden, the Reefers Arms. And when the Golden Link was being advertised, it had a bar, billiard room, sitting and dining rooms, and an extensive suite of excellent bedrooms. Even the hotels, even the stone hotels, had an extension to them, and I'm just going to have to put my glasses on, things are getting a bit blurry. So here we've got these sort of had extra bits for their kitchen or their ablution block. Now, kitchen was important for the very simple reason that you can contain fire, which is but you put people in the stone part, because the stone had the big advantage. In summer it was cool, in winter you could warm it quite well. Whereas in the corrugated iron part, it really didn't matter. You did the work in there and then got out. So what we've got here, this is the Nevis Crossing Hotel. So you've got the bar here. Now, why don't you want the people in the bar warm? Well, you don't. If they want warmth, they have to go and stay the night in the hotel. So if you're standing here, you're standing in the cold bar. Over here, you've got the kitchen area, and this is a different, slightly different view of the same hotel. So you can see there, this is really big. It's still there, the stone structure with the stone chimney. But here, corrugated iron on the ceiling, and a corrugated iron extension there. Advertising always said things like good stabling, or a large billiard table, or most commodious dining room, or whatever, or the most business in the area, or a good garden. And mentioning gardens, I'll just touch on, this is a letter by a Norwegian miner called Charles Lawson. He was Carl Lawson was his real name. He changed his name to Charles Lawson so that he could get a shipping berth out of Liverpool when he was a seaman, ended up at Bendigo. This is the only contemporary letter from Bendigo that we've got. And he writes wonderfully. He's got to remember he's Norwegian, but he describes here, everyone has a nice little cottage and a nice garden, fowls and goats and cows. And mostly all has flowers, whether they are single or married. For houses are very cheap. Why have I written horses? Houses are very cheap here, and they're all very kind and nice. So you can see we can get the very best of fruit and vegetables very cheap. What I mean there is, if you go up to Bendigo now, you don't see any hint that there were gardens around. You don't see any hint at all. But he's describing this sort of floral display at the front of each, and a vegetable garden behind. So here's Bendigo. These are just two that I picked at random. This one here is a Chinese hut. We know it's Chinese simply from the artifacts that were left there, and quite distinctively it had a pig pen beside it, and we actually know who was raising pigs there. So that's here. But look at this. Beyond it, there's this enormous garden. Absolutely enormous. And then this one here, you look at that and you think, I mean, this does look pretty much like a typical central Otago miner's hut. But what you don't notice is right beside it this vast garden. These guys were gardening on a large scale. Why? It kept the cost of living down. This is from these here are from a map that was done in 1876. And he actually, obviously he measured these gardens so large that he actually noted it on his map there, the chap McKee, who was doing the surveying. The nature of housing actually shows up if this is an example of how you registered to vote. So this is the Goldfields electorate, and I see we've got a bit fuzzy. I'm just going to see if I can improve that really just slightly. There we go. 1866, there's a mixture of housing, so 442 separate residences. About 40% have no construction details, so we have to make a guess there. 18% are sod and thatch. So sod is not mud bricks. Sod is those squares of soil that I told you about before. Wood and calico. Mud and wattle, or a thatched house. So that's roughly 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, I suppose. Houses were like that. 37% were wood and iron. In other words, the majority were that flat-packed iron cottage I was telling you about. And then only 2% were stone cottages. Now, I actually suspect that many of the unspecified ones were actually stone, because it sort of makes the remaining sort of houses a bit hard to gauge. But if we look at our next slide, we can actually see some of the thatched ones. Now this one's late. This one's 1870 at Waipori, and he has built himself a sod and thatch house. Now why he's done that, how much would it cost of him to have built it? He probably bought the manuka poles, and it was normally manuka, from his last house. If he didn't have manuka, he had other poles, but they would transport them. Poles are easy to transport. You just attach them to the side of your saddle and literally drag one end and the other end's carried by the horse. Virtually free. If he's got a window, now notice his windows have not got any glass in, so he's just got some sort of material covering. This one here is a bit more solid, but again, what we've got is sod Now, he's done quite a bit more to it. These people, this is in Queenstown, he's actually for thatch. This guy here has got Raupo. Now, Raupo's not a bad thatch. I don't know how good this would have been, because you can probably guess from what's in the background what he's thatched that with. And that's cabbage tree leaves. And I don't know that cabbage tree leaves would have been a good thatch. I wonder how long it took him to decide what I really need to do is invest in some corrugated iron. But he's even got, so this is a sod house that he's got glass in there. So if we now look at, so that's sod houses. Big advantage, if you had no money you could build on. You could probably build 95% of that without any cost at all except your own labour. And it was a lot better than being in a tent, because once you'd enclosed it, once you'd roofed it, even if it was with just the thatch, you could then put a floor in, you could then put walls in, you could then line it, you could then, as money allowed, put corrugated iron over the top of this. You don't replace your thatch, because your thatch gives you some insulation. And so from there, let's turn though to stone houses. These are the ones that the photographers get so excited about. I mean, well, look at me, I took these. Because they sort of have people looking at them and trying to work out what kind of Tetris people played to actually fit in them. What would have had families living in basically a single room structure. See, unlike Nelson and the West Coast, you've got to remember, Nelson and the West Coast had something completely different, and that was timber. Not just timber, but timber that was easily milled, easily shaped, easily turned into permanent houses. And there are houses all over the coast and in the Nelson region that date back from the 1850s and 60s that are still being lived in. Okay, they're not in their original condition, but you can do that. There's no timber here, so they're built out of... But you look at this and you think, how on earth? How did they raise? Were they always by themselves? And the answer is no. But if we have a look at these a bit closer, let's look at in the Rise and Shine Valley. Now look at that tiny, tiny hut there. This was worked for about 80 years, this area. And the main area of settlement has 4 or 5 families centred on the Rise and Shine Sluicing Syndicate. If you watch my video about water-powered gold rush, I talk about Charles Peace and what he built up as a asset in this particular one. This cottage is one of several scattered in the areas. In 1871, the Bendigo correspondent of the Cromwell Argus reported that, quote, the Rise and Shine Company are making additions, now listen to this, to their already substantial residences. That's not that. He sells, remember that advert in the other one, in the other show, a furnished house with a small garden attached, wash house and all necessary outbuildings. Now I'm not seeing any outbuildings there. The purchaser talked of his house being large enough to accommodate a visiting Māori family who enjoyed the opportunity to use his bath and wash the dust of the road from their hair and mow it. The chap who bought Peace's house describes a 4-roomed house at variance with what you see today. And if you look at all the ones that are sort of identified, this is not the same one as that one. This one here I've actually moved further along the valley, and this is sort of next door. It's not that far away actually. All of the stone cottages, there's about 9 of them. None of them have outbuildings, and there are several explanations. One, you can make the case stone cottages are the first buildings erected, and then additions from other ones are added later. The houses were made of wood or corrugated iron. The stone structures reflect early temporary structures or some combination of the two. So before I address this, I want us to look at one example that I know a great deal about. This is at a place called Stuart Town up at Bannockburn. So this is above Bannockburn. You can walk up there. This wall here has just not long ago fallen down actually, but this is a mud brick. Now mud brick's different to sod. Mud brick, you take mud, chopped horsehair, straw and cow dung and a bit of water, and you dig a circular trench and you put all those in, and then you lead a horse round and round and round, and the horse, by walking through this mixture, mixes it all in and pugs it. Pugging is the official term. You then lift it out, form it into a wooden box, into a square, take the wooden box off and let it bake in the sun. That's your mud brick wall. So that's what these are. They're quite uniformly made and they last quite well. In fact, if you keep them under cover, there's no reason why they won't last indefinitely. This one's out in the weather, which is why it's fallen down. So you look at this and think, how the heck did a family live up here? Well, now we know the family, we actually know the name of them and everything. They lived up here for about 40 years, raised a family. How did they do that? How, come on. How are you going to live in a house that size? Well, what if I showed you it in use? That's the same house. Can you see here? Now, this is different because they no longer are maintaining the mud brick. When you turn it into a house, the way you maintain it is to render it. So what you do is you put a mud coating and you regularly do this, smooth it off, and then ideally paint it with whitewash, which is lime and slaked lime and water mixed. You don't paint it with any fancy paint, it's got to be breathable. If you do that, it'll last indefinitely. So there's the mud brick home. But where are they living? Well, they've actually got an extension on here that, first of all, it doubles the frontage. That's the first thing. But secondly, instead of just being one room deep, this actually is 2 rooms deep. Okay, so this goes back double the distance, and it's got iron, it's got wood, and they've even got a finial in the roof there. And then, now I'm not sure if this shows up on the video clearly, but there is another building there, and that is the laundry. And then there is another building through here behind it. Those are 2 different buildings, and that is the kitchen. This was a really big, really comfortable house. There you've got the Aiken family, Charles Angel, Margaret Aiken and Charles Angel Jr. They lived there for 40 years, and I'm sorry, they actually don't look like they're suffering that much. So if you look now, so when you go back, you look at that, oh, poor people, how tough that would have been. Oh, well, no, sorry, you're not poor people, you look quite happy. So if we go and look at the stone remnants of houses, so look at this one. This happens to have been probably a butcher's shop or a general store. Cannot find any evidence for anything else, but here you've got a structure, but there, can you see that? There's the outline of another structure. That's where the corrugated iron and timber was. Each of the stone cottages, now this is the most photographed stone cottage probably in New Zealand, up at Bendigo. You can drive up there and have a look. But just here, there's another structure. And there's these 2 very neat lines. They've actually built the stone wall around the wooden uprights. You can see them a bit clearer here. But that's quite a decent addition. They're not living in a tiny little hovel anymore. This house here is quite a good size anyway. I mean, it would have been at least 2 rooms. Have a look at the New Zealand movie called Good for Nothing, because they use this in Good for Nothing as a Native American house. I won't say too much more. You should see the film. It's very good. But at Cambrians, there is actually a house that fully illustrates what I'm trying to tell you. So we have the main house here, and this house is mud brick. Absolutely guaranteed, partly because you can't see it on the photo, I'm sorry, but you can actually see where the whitewash, remember what I said about how you paint it, the whitewash has flaked off and you can actually see the mud. This is a mud brick house, and then they have an extension. So there's the mud brick part, there's the extension, which is corrugated iron over a wooden frame. And then at the back, you can actually see they've used stacked stone and mud brick at the back of that house. I didn't get to go look in there. I didn't actually know who owned it, but there's a chap, Bob Berry up there, who took me to have a look at it. The point I'm making is that if you looked at that as a ruin, you'd go, oh, imagine those poor people living there. You look at this now, well, people are still living in it as a holiday home, and they don't look like they're suffering too much. See, no one lived in a roofless shell. You look at the ruin and you don't get an idea of what was actually there. So houses like this one, that was, this is Studham's house in Cardrona. Now that there was a mud brick home, and quite a substantial one. They lived there for quite a long time. But they lined this, they insulated it, they put windows in, they put a brick chimney, they put extensions on the back, and they lived comfortable lives. It was a warm place, it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a wooden floor that raised it off. There were flagstones underneath to stop any rising damp. It was dry, and most importantly in central Otago, in summer, the thickness of the wall, whether it was mud brick or stone, in summer kept the interior cool. Now in winter, different story in winter, because what you do is they only had coal, they didn't have wood. You put some coal smouldering in the fire. Now there was quite an art to running a coal fire, and I never had it. All I'd create is smoke when I try. But they would light this coal fire and heap it up so that it smouldered. It didn't burn, you didn't see lots of flame, but the heat would radiate out. And the idea with a fire is you basically start the fire in mid-April and you put it out in about early September. And that heat would actually heat the space but also heat the walls, and you'd walk in, even when the fire was burnt right down into cinders, and it would be warm in winter. I mean, they had snow outside, and yet the snow wouldn't settle on the roof because the fires would keep going very, very well. As I say, it became quite an art. Now, I've been into, this is in Inniscourt Road. I talked to the people and they were kind enough to let me in this. This is a cottage that was built. They've actually got a beautiful house beside it, but they use this as a sleep out. And I said to them, what's it like being in there? And they said, well, we have to fight the grandchildren for who's going to sleep in there because it is so comfortable in summer. They're not complaining about the heat. And then in winter, they said, obviously we don't have a coal fire anymore, but they said all they need is a small heater. They put it on the small heater running early in the morning, and then it carries on at night. And then I might just take the chance to destroy a couple of myths and upset people in Alexandra, which is never a bad thing. When the warehouse was going to build one of their big red ugly sheds in Alexandra, the town came along, the Central Otago District Council came along and said, no, you're not building one of your plug ugly red things. We want it to look like Alexandra. So what they did is they had exposed schist And then when Alexandra School was being built again, we've lost a bit of focus again. We'll just tighten that up a wee bit. There. I'm hoping that makes it a bit easier to see. In Alexandra School, they had exposed schist, and this is what Central Otago looks like. And I took one look and said, no, it didn't. This is not what you looked like. Let me show you. This is a place called O'Donnell's Store. Now, Doc persists in using the wrong label on this map. They call it Goodall's Store. It wasn't. So this is a series of structures, actually. I'll tell you. So what we've got, this started off as a butchery. So in the gap between, it's a bit hard to see, just in there was a butcher's. And you can tell it's a butcher's because there's a hole in the ground, quite a deep hole, and that was how you kept your carcasses cool. You're using the insulation power of the ground. You dig a hole that would probably be 2.5, 3 meters deep, so it's decent. And you'd line it with wood, and then you put a trapdoor over it that was quite small, and that had sods on the top. But if you put anything in there, it actually stayed cool for a long time. They used to line it with ice during winter, but even through summer, you could keep meat in there for quite a long time. And then this is a stables, and beside it there's an ancillary room for hay. This here was the combination house, store and hotel. And then further, you can only see part of it, was a bakery. And he operated that. He first built it in 1866 and didn't leave it until almost exactly 40 years later in 1907. His wife died of apoplexy chasing a wild pig. And so Charles O'Donnell shifted onto his farm with his family. And when he died, he was known as a farmer. But this, as I say, this carried on for a long time. But this wall contains a secret. Now, I'm hoping this shows up on the video, but can you see these lines? They did not use exposed schist. They covered it. They would render over the top and then paint it with slaked lime. They wanted pastel-coloured, smooth, brick-like structures. Not this. This wasn't what they did. What do I mean? Have a look at this house. Look at that. I love these people. I don't know where it is. I've got a feeling that it's in Clyde, because I've looked at a couple of buildings. But look, what they've done is they've smoothed over the schist. That schist, it's not bricks. They've smoothed it over and they've picked out the shape of bricks exactly like that. You can see the brick shapes? And you look at a lot of the schist homes in Central Otago, and that's actually what they were. So even when you look at the schist, you kind of look and think, oh, look how tough that life was. No, they rendered them, they painted them, they made them look like brick, they put windows in, they put floors in. They made them really, really comfortable. That house there would have been quite nice to live in. It wouldn't have been hard at all. You would have lived there quite happily. I would have lived there quite happily. The only thing stopping that one from being around, by the way, is it's sitting on a gold deposit. So eventually some miners bought it off that family, and then the entire house got demolished, and then all of the trees, all of the dirt, everything got sluiced away because, as I say, there was gold underneath it. So hopefully that helps. If you've got any questions, feel free to email them to me. Goodbye.